The morning sun cast long shadows across the steps of Temple Beth Shalom in Brooklyn when Rabbi David Goldstein discovered it. A simple wooden frame, no bigger than a prayer book, left carefully against the synagogue's front door. Inside the glass was an image he recognized immediately: the Virgin Mary, hands folded in prayer, her blue mantle dotted with stars. Rabbi Goldstein's jaw tightened. This was the third time this month someone had left Christian materials at his temple. First it was pamphlets tucked under windshield wipers in the parking lot. Then rosary beads scattered on the steps after Shabbat services. Now this. Evangelicals, he muttered under his breath, picking up the frame with obvious distaste. At 52, he had spent nearly 3 decades leading this Orthodox congregation through the changing demographics of Brooklyn. He'd seen every kind of missionary attempt, from subtle to aggressive. This felt like harassment. The image itself was beautiful, he had to admit. The woman's face carried a serene expression, her dark eyes seeming to follow him as he held the frame at arm's length. But beauty didn't matter. This was idolatry, plain and simple. His congregation didn't need confusion about their faith. Without ceremony, Rabbi Goldstein walked around to the dumpster behind the temple. The metal lid clanged as he lifted it, tossing the framed image among the week's trash coffee grounds, crumpled bulletins, and leftover halal from Friday night services. Superstition, he said aloud, dusting his hands. Inside, morning prayers awaited. Real prayers to the one true God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, not to statues or images or dead saints. As he walked back toward the temple entrance, Rabbi Goldstein didn't notice the faint shimmer that passed across the dumpster's surface, like heat waves rising from summer pavement. He didn't see the way the morning light seemed to linger there, growing brighter rather than fading as clouds passed overhead. But Mrs. Rosen noticed. From her kitchen window across the alley, the elderly synagogue treasurer watched the rabbi disappear inside. She'd seen him throw something away, and now that spot behind the temple seemed to glow with an inner light that made her arthritic hands tingle just watching. Something had just begun in Brooklyn. Something that would challenge everything this neighborhood thought it knew about faith, miracles, and the boundaries between different kinds of prayer. That evening, as Rabbi Goldstein locked up after the final prayers, something was different. The temple's ancient heating system, which had been coughing and wheezing for months, hummed with perfect efficiency. The basement boiler that usually required 3 attempts to start had fired up immediately when he tested it. Finally, he muttered, assuming the repair company had made an unscheduled visit. But when he checked the service log, no one had been there. The system that had been scheduled for expensive replacement next month now ran like it was brand new. Across the alley, Mrs. Rosen was having her own moment of wonder. She'd gone to take out her evening trash, her arthritic hands gripping the bag with the usual sharp pain that had plagued her for 15 years. But as she approached the dumpster behind the temple, the pain simply vanished. She stopped, flexing her fingers in amazement. The joints that had been swollen and stiff since morning moved freely, without even a twinge. She set down the trash bag and stared at her hands in the streetlight, watching them bend and flex like they had 20 years ago. Baruch Hashem, she whispered, the Hebrew blessing falling from her lips automatically. But even as she said it, her eyes were drawn to the dumpster where Rabbi Goldstein had thrown the image that morning. The metal container seemed to shimmer faintly in the darkness, though she couldn't explain why. Meanwhile, inside the temple, Rabbi Goldstein was experiencing his own unsettling moment. As he walked through the sanctuary, turning off lights, he heard something that made him freeze. Singing, faint but unmistakable. A woman's voice, soft and melodic, echoing from somewhere inside the empty building. He searched every room, every closet, every corner. Nothing. The voice had stopped, but the memory of it lingered. It had sounded almost like a lullaby, the kind his own mother had sung to him as a child in Yiddish. But there was something else woven into the melody, something that made his heart race with recognition he couldn't name. Walking home through the Brooklyn streets, Rabbi Goldstein tried to rationalize the evening. Old buildings made strange sounds. Arthritis came and went unpredictably. Boilers sometimes fixed themselves when components finally settled into place. But deep down, in a place he didn't want to acknowledge, he knew these weren't coincidences. Something had begun when he threw away that image. Something that felt both foreign and familiar, like a prayer spoken in a language he'd once known but had forgotten. The night air carried the faint scent of roses, though no gardens bloomed in the concrete landscape around him. And somewhere in the distance, he could swear he heard that lullaby again. Maria Santos arrived at Temple Beth Shalom before dawn, as she had every Tuesday and Thursday for the past 8 years. The 60-year-old Catholic woman took pride in keeping the Jewish house of worship spotless, seeing her work as a form of service to the God they both served, even if they called him by different names. As she wheeled her cleaning cart around to the dumpster area, something caught her eye. A soft glow emanated from inside the metal container, like candlelight flickering behind frosted glass. Maria crossed herself instinctively, her rosary beads clicking softly in her apron pocket. Lifting the dumpster lid, she gasped. There, nestled among coffee grounds and crumpled papers, was a framed image of the Blessed Virgin Mary. But this wasn't just any image. The glass seemed to pulse with inner light, and the Virgin's painted eyes looked directly at her with unmistakable love and sorrow. "Virgin Santissima," Maria whispered, reaching in with trembling hands. The moment her fingers touched the frame, warmth spread up her arms like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. The chronic back pain that had plagued her for decades simply vanished. "My son loves every child of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. What they call foreign, heaven calls family." The vision lasted only seconds, but it left Maria transformed. She understood now why the image had been discarded and why it had to be preserved. With reverence, she carried it to her supply closet in the temple basement, arranging it carefully among cleaning supplies and folded towels. She lit a votive candle from her personal collection, the kind Rabbi Goldstein had always allowed her to burn during her work, understanding it brought her comfort. The small flame seemed to dance in response to the Virgin's presence, casting moving shadows that looked almost like Hebrew letters on the basement walls. For the rest of the morning, Maria cleaned with unusual energy, her normally aching joints moving freely. When Rabbi Goldstein arrived for his morning study session, he found the temple more spotless than ever, though he couldn't shake the feeling that something profound had shifted in the very air of the building. In the basement, behind bottles of floor cleaner and boxes of prayer books, the Virgin of Mary watched over Temple Beth Shalom with eyes full of tears and hope. Rabbi Goldstein sat in his study Friday evening, surrounded by towers of ancient texts. The Talmud lay open beside commentaries from Maimonides and Rashi, their yellowed pages offering no answers to his growing crisis of understanding. For 3 nights, he had barely slept, wrestling with testimonies that challenged everything his Orthodox training had taught him. Mrs. Rosen's arthritis, gone. Jacob Schwartz's asthma, vanished. Mrs. O'Brien's decades of grief, lifted. And these were just the cases he knew about. Word was spreading through both Jewish and Catholic neighborhoods about healings connected to the temple grounds. Avodah Zarah, he muttered to himself, using the Hebrew term for idolatry. That's what this had to be. But how could idolatry heal? How could false worship bring such obvious blessings? He pulled down his copy of the Mishneh Torah, searching Maimonides' writings on faith and healing. The great medieval rabbi had been clear. God alone heals. God alone performs miracles. Yet the Virgin Mary was undeniably connected to these events. The logical contradiction made his head throb. A knock on his study door interrupted his torment. "Come in," he called, expecting his wife with tea. Instead, Jacob Schwartz entered with his parents, Sarah and David. The boy's cheeks were pink with health, his breathing effortless. "Rabbi," David Schwartz said quietly, "we need to talk." Jacob's doctors ran every test. His lungs are completely clear, not just improved, but perfect, like he never had asthma at all. They're calling it medically impossible. Sarah's eyes were wet with tears of joy and confusion. "Rabbi, we're Orthodox Jews. We don't believe in Christian saints. But something happened to our son, something miraculous. How do we understand this?" Rabbi Goldstein looked at the boy, truly looked at him. Jacob's previous pallor was gone, replaced by vibrant health. The child who had spent most synagogue services in the lobby, struggling to breathe, now stood strong and steady. "I don't know," Rabbi Goldstein admitted, his voice cracking. "I threw away that image because I thought it was superstition. But the healing started immediately after. I can't deny what's happening, but I can't explain it either." Later that night, alone again with his books, Rabbi Goldstein did something he hadn't done since rabbinical school. He called his former teacher, Rabbi Mordecai Rosen in Jerusalem. Not Mrs. Rosen's relative, but one of the most respected Talmudic scholars in the world. "Rebbe," he said when the elderly voice answered, "I need guidance on a matter of great confusion." He explained everything: the image, the healings, his theological crisis. The long silence that followed made him wonder if the connection had dropped. Finally, Rabbi Rosen spoke. "David, sometimes God works in ways that confound our categories. The mother of Yeshua was a Jewish woman. Perhaps you should pray for understanding rather than certainty." The words hit like lightning. For the first time in days, Rabbi Goldstein felt a path forward, even if he couldn't see where it led. By Sunday morning, the miracle stories had spread through Brooklyn's Orthodox community like wildfire, splitting families and congregations down middle. At Temple Beth Shalom's morning service, tension filled the sanctuary like incense. In the third row, the Goldberg family sat in stony silence. Abraham Goldberg, a Torah scholar and longtime temple board member, had forbidden his wife from speaking to Mrs. Rosen about her so-called healing. He'd heard enough blasphemy for 1 week. "It's Christian missionary work," he whispered harshly to his neighbor. "They plant these stories to confuse us, to make us question our faith. Next they'll be telling us we need their Messiah." But 3 rows behind them, the Schwartz family glowed with quiet joy. Jacob sat between his parents, breathing freely for the first time in his 12 years. Sarah Schwartz couldn't help but smile as she watched her son participate fully in the service, no longer wheezing through the prayers. The division grew sharper as word reached the broader community. Rabbi Stern from the competing Orthodox synagogue across Flatbush Avenue issued a statement Friday afternoon. "Any Jew who attributes healing power to Christian imagery has strayed from the path of Abraham. We must reject these foreign influences." Meanwhile, 6 blocks south in the Catholic neighborhood, a different kind of pilgrimage had begun. Families started walking past Temple Beth Shalom during their evening strolls, many carrying rosaries, hoping for a glimpse of whatever divine presence had healed Mrs. O'Brien and transformed her grief into peace. Father Mackenzie at St. Patrick's Church found himself fielding unusual questions during confession. "Father," whispered Mrs. Catalano, "is it wrong to pray near a synagogue? I heard Mary appeared there, but it feels strange praying where they don't believe in Jesus." The priest struggled for answers. Marian apparitions were part of Catholic tradition, but at a Jewish temple, it challenged everything he understood about interfaith boundaries. By Tuesday evening, small groups of Catholics had begun gathering across the street from Temple Beth Shalom, kneeling on the sidewalk at sunset, reciting the rosary in hushed tones. They weren't protesting or proselytizing, just praying, drawn by stories of miraculous healing. Rabbi Goldstein watched from his office window, his heart heavy with conflict. Some of his own congregants now questioned his leadership. "You threw away a holy image," Mrs. Rosen had told him gently. "Maybe God wanted it there." But Abraham Goldberg demanded action. "Rabbi, these Catholics are turning our temple into a shrine. This undermines everything we stand for. You must make them stop." The neighborhood was fracturing along lines of faith and fear, hope and tradition. Some saw God working beyond human boundaries. Others saw dangerous erosion of sacred truths. In the basement supply closet, the Virgin's image continued to glow softly, waiting for hearts to open wide enough to hold both mystery and faith. Wednesday evening's Mincha service began like any other. 23 congregants gathered in Temple Beth Shalom Sanctuary, their voices joining in the ancient Hebrew prayers that had echoed through centuries. Rabbi Goldstein stood at the bima, leading the Amidah with practiced reverence. But as they reached the Kedusha, the holiest part of the service, something extraordinary happened. A soft light began emanating from the ark containing the Torah scrolls. At first, congregants assumed it was late afternoon sun streaming through the stained glass windows. But the light grew brighter, warmer, and distinctly different from sunlight. Mrs. Rosen gasped first. There, standing beside the eternal flame, was a woman clothed in blue and white, the colors of both the Virgin's traditional mantle and the Israeli flag. Her dark hair was covered modestly, as befitted a Jewish woman, and her olive skin glowed with inner radiance. But most remarkable were the Hebrew letters of light surrounding her. Not random symbols, but actual words forming in luminous script across the sanctuary walls. Shalom Aleichem, and Baruch Hashem, and Am Yisrael Chai. The congregation stood frozen as the figure spoke, her voice carrying the accent of ancient Judea, speaking Aramaic that somehow everyone understood. My children, I am Miriam of Nazareth, daughter of David's line. I come not as a stranger, but as your sister, a Jewish mother who carried the light of Israel to all nations. Abraham Goldberg collapsed into his seat, his face pale with shock. Jacob Schwartz instinctively moved closer to his parents, his healthy lungs drawing deep, steady breaths. Even the most skeptical congregants found themselves unable to deny what stood before them. I weep for the divisions among my son's people, Miriam continued, tears of light streaming down her face. Jews and Christians, Muslims and others, all children of Abraham, all precious in the eyes of the Holy One. My prayers rise for each soul that seeks truth, regardless of the name they speak in darkness. Rabbi Goldstein's prayer book fell from his trembling hands. Everything he had been taught about boundaries, about theological purity, crumbled in the face of this Jewish mother who spoke with divine authority, yet claimed kinship with those who followed her son. The vision lasted only minutes, but its impact was eternal. As Miriam's form began to fade, she spoke once more. Tell them I never stopped being a Jewish daughter. Tell them a mother's love knows no walls. When the light finally dimmed, the sanctuary held only the echo of weeping, tears of awe, confusion, and overwhelming recognition that heaven itself had entered their holy space. In the silence that followed, Rabbi Goldstein understood that everything had changed. The question was no longer whether miracles were happening, but how to respond to the God who worked beyond every boundary they had tried to build. By Friday morning, word of the apparition had reached beyond Brooklyn's Orthodox community to desperate families throughout New York City. Cars with license plates from New Jersey, Connecticut, and Long Island began parking along the streets surrounding Temple Beth Shalom. The first to arrive was the Ahmad family from Queens. Their 80-year-old son Omar had been battling leukemia for 2 years, and conventional treatments had failed. Rashid Ahmad, a devout Muslim, had heard whispers in his mosque about a Jewish mother appearing at a synagogue. Miriam, as she was known in Islam, the blessed mother of Prophet Isa. Please, Rashid whispered to Rabbi Goldstein outside the temple gates, his wife Fatima holding their frail son. We know she's holy to you also. May we pray here for our boy. Rabbi Goldstein looked into the father's desperate eyes and saw his own heart reflected. How could he deny a father's love? Of course, he said quietly. God hears all sincere prayers. As the Ahmad family knelt on the sidewalk outside the temple, reciting verses from the Quran about Miriam's purity and power, something miraculous began. Color returned to Omar's pale cheeks. His listless eyes brightened. By the time they finished their prayers, the boy was sitting up on his own, asking for water with a voice grown strong. Word spread through the gathered crowd like electricity. Mrs. Goldstein from the Jewish nursing home brought her 90-year-old father, a Holocaust survivor whose nightmares had tormented him for 70 years. As his wheelchair approached the temple steps, the old man suddenly began speaking. Not in English or Yiddish, but in fluent Hebrew prayers he claimed to have forgotten decades ago. "The darkness is lifting," he whispered to his daughter, tears streaming down his weathered face. "For the first time since the camps, I feel peace." Maria Santos arrived early for her cleaning duties to find the temple grounds transformed into an outdoor sanctuary. Jewish families sat beside Muslim ones. Catholic grandmothers shared rosary beads with Protestant ministers, and all prayed in their own languages to the same God. When young Rebecca Chun arrived with her Buddhist parents from Chinatown, her cerebral palsy had left her unable to walk. But as her father wheeled her chair near the spot where Rabbi Goldstein had discarded the Virgin's image, Rebecca suddenly stood, unsteady at first, then with growing confidence. "Mama," she cried in Mandarin, taking her first independent steps. "The light lady says I can dance now." Dr. Sarah Goldsmith, a pediatric oncologist from Mount Sinai, had come skeptically to document what she assumed was mass hysteria. Instead, she found herself witnessing medically impossible recoveries. Children with terminal diagnoses playing normally, adults with chronic pain walking freely, psychological trauma dissolving before her eyes. "I can't explain any of this," she admitted to a reporter who had arrived to cover the phenomenon. "But I can't deny what I'm seeing either." As the sun set over Brooklyn, the temple grounds held hundreds of families from every faith tradition, united by hope and amazed by grace that recognized no denominational boundaries. Monday morning brought a circus to the quiet Brooklyn neighborhood. News vans lined the streets around Temple Beth Shalom, their satellite dishes reaching toward heaven like electronic prayers. CNN, Fox News, NBC, every major network had dispatched crews to cover what reporters were calling the Brooklyn Miracle. Jessica Martinez from Channel 7 News had come expecting to debunk another religious hoax. A seasoned investigative journalist with 15 years of experience exposing fraudulent faith healers, she arrived armed with skepticism and a cameraman trained to spot manipulation. "Rabbi Goldstein," she said, cornering him outside the temple, "you understand people are claiming miraculous healings connected to a Catholic image at your Jewish synagogue. What's your response to critics who say this is elaborate theater?" The rabbi, exhausted from 3 nights of prayer and soul-searching, met her gaze directly. "Ms. Martinez, I threw away that image myself. I called it superstition, but I cannot deny what has happened since. Children who couldn't breathe are running. Elderly people in wheelchairs are walking. Families torn by grief have found peace." As if summoned by his words, Omar Ahmad appeared, racing through the temple courtyard with the boundless energy of a healthy 80-year-old. Jessica's cameraman automatically followed, capturing the boy's parents weeping with joy as they watched their formerly dying son play soccer with Jacob Schwartz. "This child had end-stage leukemia 4 days ago," Dr. Sarah Goldsmith explained to the growing crowd of reporters. She held up medical records with shaking hands. "His latest blood work shows no trace of cancer. None. His oncologist in Queens is calling it medically impossible." Tom Henderson from the Washington Post had flown in from D.C. specifically to expose what he assumed was mass hysteria combined with social media manipulation. But as his photographer snapped pictures of the temple grounds, something extraordinary happened in the viewfinder. "Do you see that?" the photographer whispered, showing Tom the camera's LCD screen. In several shots, a translucent figure in blue appeared beside healing families, visible in the photographs but invisible to the naked eye. Henderson studied the digital images, running them through his phone's authenticity software. No manipulation detected, no digital artifacts, just the unexplained presence of something or someone blessing the gathered crowds. By evening, the story had exploded across social media. Brooklyn Miracle trended globally as people shared testimonies, photos, and videos. Religious leaders from multiple faiths issued statements ranging from cautious support to outright skepticism. Cardinal Murphy from the Archdiocese of New York announced a formal investigation. "While we cannot authenticate these events without thorough examination, we acknowledge the profound spiritual experiences many claim to have witnessed. Rabbi Jonathan Roth from the Union of Orthodox Jewish Congregations was more direct. Miracles come from Hashem alone. We must be cautious about attributing divine power to any intermediary, regardless of the apparent results. But for the hundreds of families still gathering each evening at Temple Beth Shalom, official statements mattered less than lived reality. They had touched the hem of something holy, and their lives would never be the same. Thursday evening brought an unprecedented gathering to Temple Beth Shalom's social hall. Rabbi Dr. Samuel Goldstein from Jewish Theological Seminary sat across from Father Thomas Aquino from Fordham University, their years of interfaith dialogue finally converging on something concrete and miraculous. The historical record is clear, Rabbi Goldstein said, spreading ancient texts across the table. Miriam of Nazareth was a Jewish daughter, raised in Jewish law, devoted to Jewish faith. Her song in Luke's Gospel echoes Hannah's prayer from 1 Samuel almost word for word. Father Aquino nodded, pulling out his own research. And here, in the writings of St. Jerome, we find references to early Jewish Christians who continued honoring Mary as both mother of the Messiah and faithful daughter of Israel. The tradition isn't foreign, it's forgotten. Rabbi David Goldstein listened intently from the corner, his own theological crisis finding unexpected resolution in scholarly discourse. Dr. Ruth Goldberg, a religious studies professor from Brooklyn College, leaned forward with excitement. "Look at this," she said, opening a medieval manuscript. 12th century Jewish commentaries actually acknowledge Mary's righteousness. Maimonides himself wrote about the worthy mothers of Israel, including those who bore children of significance to both Jews and Gentiles. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. What had seemed like theological contradiction was actually historical continuity broken by centuries of persecution and misunderstanding. Father Aquino's voice was quiet with wonder. We've been treating Jewish veneration of Mary as conversion rather than recognition. But what if it's actually recovery? Jews reclaiming their own daughter who was never meant to be foreign to them. Outside in the temple courtyard, families continued their evening vigils. Mrs. Rosen knelt beside Fatima Ahmad, their rosary beads and prayer shawls intertwined as they prayed for continued healing for their communities. The sight would have scandalized both their grandparents, yet felt perfectly natural under Brooklyn's starlit sky. Rabbi Goldstein found his voice trembling as he spoke. When she appeared to us, she called herself Miriam of Nazareth, daughter of David's line. Not the Virgin Mary of Catholic devotion, but our sister Miriam, who somehow became mother to hope itself. The scholarly breakthrough rippled through religious communities worldwide. Seminary professors began re-examining centuries of theological separation. Ancient texts were dusted off, revealing layers of shared heritage that had been buried under institutional divisions. Cardinal Murphy issued a revised statement. "We are discovering that Mary belongs not to one faith tradition, but to the family of Abraham itself. Her Jewish identity enhances rather than threatens Catholic understanding." Rabbi Jonathan Roth from the Orthodox Union admitted publicly, "Perhaps our ancestors understood something we forgot, that recognizing Mary's righteousness as a Jewish mother doesn't diminish our faith in the Almighty, but acknowledges His choice to work through our people." By Friday evening, Temple Beth Shalom had become more than a healing site. It was a classroom where ancient truths were being rediscovered and theological walls were crumbling into bridges of understanding. 6 months after Rabbi Goldstein had thrown away the Virgin's image, the Brooklyn neighborhood around Temple Beth Shalom had transformed into something unprecedented in American religious history. What began with healings had evolved into a living model of interfaith cooperation that drew pilgrims from around the world. The temple courtyard now featured a carefully designed interfaith prayer garden. Rabbi Goldstein had worked with Father Aquino and Imam Abdullah from the local Islamic Center to create sacred space that welcomed all of Abraham's children. The recovered image of Mary, now respectfully called Miriam of Nazareth, was displayed alongside Hebrew scriptures and Islamic calligraphy, all beneath a canopy of stars reminiscent of her original blue mantle. "This is what heaven looks like," whispered Dr. Sarah Chun, the Buddhist physician whose daughter Rebecca had learned to walk here. She knelt beside Mrs. Rosen, who was teaching Omar Ahmed's sister to read Hebrew prayers. Nearby, Holocaust survivor Isaac Goldman shared his testimony with a group of Muslim teenagers, showing them his concentration camp tattoo while explaining how Miriam's appearance had healed decades of nightmares. The transformation extended beyond the temple grounds. Goldberg's Deli now served halal options alongside kosher ones. O'Brien's Irish Pub hosted interfaith discussion groups every Thursday evening. The Ahmad family had opened a community kitchen next to their mosque, feeding anyone who came to pray in the neighborhood regardless of their faith background. "We call it the Miriam effect," explained Maria Santos, who had become the unofficial coordinator of pilgrimage groups. Her basement supply closet had been converted into a small shrine where people of all faiths left prayer requests in multiple languages. "She shows us that God's love is bigger than our categories." Rabbi Goldstein stood at his office window each evening, watching busloads of pilgrims arrive from around the world. Jewish families from Israel prayed beside Catholic grandmothers from Ireland. Muslim scholars from Turkey engaged in theological discussions with Protestant ministers from Alabama. Buddhist monks from Tibet meditated peacefully next to Orthodox rabbis from Crown Heights. The evening Abraham Goldberg approached him, Rabbi Goldstein braced for criticism. The longtime board member had opposed the interfaith developments from the beginning. Instead, Goldberg's eyes were wet with tears. "Rabbi," he said quietly, "my grandson came home from Hebrew school yesterday, singing Ave Maria in Hebrew. When I asked him where he learned it, he said the Miriam lady taught the children how her son's prayer connects to ours. I think I understand now." Local businesses thrived as religious tourism brought visitors from 6 continents. The neighborhood that had once struggled with empty storefronts now bustled with shops selling religious books in dozens of languages, restaurants serving kosher halal fusion cuisine, and art galleries featuring interfaith religious artwork. Most remarkably, crime had virtually disappeared from the area. Police Captain Rodriguez told reporters, "It's impossible to hate your neighbor when you're praying beside them every day." This neighborhood has become the safest in Brooklyn, not because of more patrols, but because of more prayers. As Rabbi Goldstein prepared for evening services in a sanctuary now shared by multiple faith communities, he reflected on the journey from discarding an image to discovering a bridge between worlds. 5 years later, Rabbi David Goldstein stood before the United Nations Interfaith Council in Manhattan, representing what scholars now call the Brooklyn model of religious cooperation. The man who had once dismissed Mary's image as superstition had become one of America's leading voices for Jewish-Catholic-Muslim dialogue. The miracle wasn't just the healings, he told the assembled delegates from 195 nations. The miracle was discovering that Miriam of Nazareth, Mary, had never stopped being our Jewish sister. When we honored her as the mother who carried light to all nations, we found our own faith expanded rather than threatened. Behind him, a photograph showed Temple Beth Shalom's interfaith prayer garden, now visited by over 100,000 pilgrims annually. The image that had been discarded in a dumpster was now enshrined in a crystal case, surrounded by prayer requests written in 37 languages. In the audience, Omar Ahmad, now 13 and completely cancer-free, listened with his parents. The boy who had been dying of leukemia was preparing for his bar mitzvah at Temple Beth Shalom. Having chosen to honor both his Islamic heritage and his connection to the Jewish community that had welcomed his family's prayers. Mrs. Rosen, now 92 but still moving with miraculous ease, had become the neighborhood's unofficial interfaith grandmother. She taught Hebrew to Catholic children and learned Arabic from Muslim teenagers, her arthritis-free hands moving gracefully as she demonstrated that love truly knew no boundaries. The Brooklyn neighborhood itself had been designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site for religious cooperation. The small area around Temple Beth Shalom hosted the world's first accredited interfaith seminary, where future religious leaders studied together rather than in isolation. Dr. Sarah Goldsmith, the pediatric oncologist who had witnessed the first healings, now directed the Miriam Institute for Faith-Based Healing, documenting over 2,000 medically verified recoveries connected to the site. "We still can't explain how it works," she admitted to medical journals, "but we can no longer deny that it does work." Maria Santos, now in her 70s, continued her role as groundskeeper and shrine coordinator. Every morning, she lit a candle in the basement supply closet where she had first discovered the glowing image. Her Catholic devotion and Jewish workplace had taught her that God's house truly had many rooms. Abraham Goldberg, the former skeptic, had written a best-selling book titled When Heaven Breaks Down Walls, describing his transformation from theological rigidity to spiritual openness. He now led tours for religious leaders worldwide who came to study the Brooklyn miracle. Young Jacob Schwartz, whose asthma healing had been among the first signs, was completing his rabbinical studies while specializing in Christian-Jewish relations. "Miriam taught us that being chosen doesn't mean being exclusive," he often said. "It means being called to bring light to everyone." As Rabbi Goldstein concluded his UN address, he looked out at representatives from every major faith tradition. "5 years ago, I threw away a picture because I feared it would divide us from God. Instead, I learned that God's love is so vast it includes even our fears, our mistakes, our stubborn hearts. The mother who appeared to us proved that heaven's family is bigger than any earthly boundaries we construct." In Brooklyn that evening, as always, the prayer garden filled with families from around the world, united in gratitude for the Jewish mother whose love had taught them all how to see God's face in their neighbors.